Welcome to the Old Bridgewater Historical Society. You're in the Memorial Building. My name is Mary O'Connell. I'm the president of the Old Bridgewater Historical Society. And before we begin the program, I need to mention a few of our upcoming events. The first one right now is iffy. It may happen, it may not happen. I just got word tonight. And the reason, it has to do with all the rain, all the water. We have been planning a jointly sponsored trail walk on October 1st to the Skim Milk Bridge and the Comfort Willis Bridge, but that's kind of up in the air right now. It has to do with the flooding. Apparently it's flooded out right now, so they haven't made a call on it yet because they're hoping that the water level goes down. So if it won't be canceled, it'll be postponed, right, Janice, until a later date. So watch our Facebook page, and we'll also put something on the website if indeed it is postponed. October 14th, this woman over here at the table and this is Kathy, our treasurer, we will be giving cemetery tours at the old graveyard in East Bridgewater. This is part of their bicentennial program. And I don't have the exact times, but they will be in sync with the 3 trolley car tours, right, that are happening that day. So watch our Facebook page for the times. And then on Sunday, November 5th at 1 p.m., we're having a lecture, Distilled in Boston, A History and Guide to Spirits, the kind you drink. And that's by Zachary Lamont. For detailed information on these programs, visit our website at www.oldbridgewater.org, and we also post everything on Facebook. So tonight our guest is Dr. Karima Lewis. Dr. Lewis teaches history at Massasoit Community College and Emerson College. Having worked in the fields of social work and law before becoming an historian, she holds a BA from Northwestern University, an MSW degree from Hunter College School of Social Work, a Juris Doctor degree from NYU School of Law, and this is a lot, right? Now we're getting into the history. And a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Wow. Dr. Lewis wrote her dissertation on the history of slave resistance in New England. And as a local public historian in the field of slavery in New England, she makes presentations on this topic within the community, all over the country, and abroad, right? We are very happy to have Dr. Lewis with here tonight to talk about slavery and freedom in Old Bridgewater. Enjoy.
Thank you. I never got an applause for my degrees. That's a new one. You know, I have an aunt who's 95 now, and years ago she said to me, she said, Karima, can I buy one of those degrees from you? But thank you, Old Bridgewater Historical Society, for inviting me. I am going to talk about, I've just been getting my research in slavery in Bridgewater, so I thought I'd start with an overview of slavery in New England to kind of set the stage, and then I'll go into some of the research that I have uncovered about Old Bridgewater. And so, slavery in colonial New England. When we say slavery in colonial New England, we're talking about the colonies of Mass Bay, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Plymouth, and we didn't have a Maine till 1820, so the Missouri Compromise, and so New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth. And so later on in this presentation, I'll show you some of the numbers that existed for slavery in those colonies. Okay. So the New England slave trade, I had a class today, and I'm teaching like a seminar class on race and gender in early America, and we were talking about slavery in New London, Connecticut, and based on an article they read. And I said, well, how did enslaved people, Africans, get to New London? And they kind of looked puzzled. They couldn't really figure that out. How did they get there? And so it's about the New England slave trade. And so with New London, there's a West Indian trade. They're bringing sugar, molasses, cotton, a little bit of cotton, and they also bring enslaved people when they come. But it's also a trade from West Africa that will come not so much to New London unless there are some slave ships involved in the trade. And Connecticut did have some slave ships involved, but mostly to Boston Harbor, and then people from Connecticut, from Rhode Island, they could purchase enslaved people in Boston. So the first Africans that arrived, and most of you probably know this already, because I'm sure I have some history buffs in this group. So the first African arrived in Boston from the West Indies in 1638. And so on this day, in 1638, the cargo that the ship brought back was cotton, tobacco, this is from the West Indies, and the first enslaved Africans to be imported. So when the Pequot, I don't say Indians, I say natives, lost the war with the English in 1638, the Pequot War, it was the defiant Pequots that made poor slaves, well, I don't know if I go along with that. So the men, the warriors, were sent into slavery in the West Indies. Many of the women and the children from this war were put into indentured servitude or into slavery. And so what happened is in an island called Tortuga, and you probably can't see Tortuga because I can barely see it without my glasses, is where the first Africans, Tortuga is right here. Got rid of it, huh? All righty, Karima. Let's go back. I'm going forward. Let's see. So Tortuga is right here. I think it's a British island now. And so these first Africans came from Tortuga. It's always good to know where, in my research, I want to know where the Africans came from. What part of Africa did they come from? What's the culture like in that part of Africa? So, research bears out that most African Americans came from West Africa. So I've done my DNA with 3 companies because I wanted to see if I get the same information from all 3 companies. So 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and another company called AfricanAncestry.com. And basically, from my DNA, I am 80% West African, right? 17% white. Okay, so I found out, it's an interesting story, and I hope I don't digress too much, but it's an interesting story. I do Ancestry.com, I do 23, and basically they say I'm 30-40% Nigerian. So almost half of me is Nigerian. And so I said, okay, I want to know which group in Nigeria do I belong to? So AfricanAncestry.com, it's a African-American DNA company in Washington, D.C. They're supposed to tell you what tribe you come from. So I do this, of course, okay, so African Ancestry costs almost $300 to do. The others, is less than $100. And I get the results back, and I'm looking and say, I must be Igbo. I think I'm Igbo. I don't, think I'm Yoruba. I know I'm Igbo. And it tells me, you are the descendant of a European woman, and your DNA match 100%. I was like, I paid you $300? for you to tell me. Don't mention Africa now. But anyway, I didn't know her name. I did my research. I know her name. I know where she comes from. And so that's that 17% that showed up. Okay, let's move on, because I can digress. Okay, so we want to go this way, Karima. So looking at, some of the images of enslaved people on ships, we know that the men were held in the hold of the ship, where you see this man going down. They were held in shackles. And so I'm going to kind of treat you like my class. So why were they held in shackles in the hold of the ship? Not the professor.
So they wouldn't revolt?
So they wouldn't revolt, right? So my research tells me there were over 900 ship revolts from about 1500 to 1800. So how did they revolt if they were shackled?
Didn't they have to beat them?
Huh?
Didn't they have to take them out of shackles to beat them?
Even to bathe, sure. So they might took advantage, but that's not the main way they were able to revolt. Because they had somebody with a gun holding over them while they're bathing or forced to dance, right?
Refuse to eat?
No, they'll force feed you. No. The women would steal the keys to the shackles because women weren't in the hold of the ship. Women were on the deck. And so why were women on the deck? And, in rooms on the deck. They're not in the hold. Why are they on the deck level, their housing?
It's a long ride across the ocean.
Professor, you know?
I have an idea.
Okay, Professor, let's hear it. We used to work together at Bridgewater. You can introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Paulo Di Gregorio.
I can never say his first name, so
Probably for the entertainment of the sailors.
probably for the entertainment. I love that kind of discreet way of saying these women were being raped and they wanted easy access to them. So when they get into the crew's cabin, they steal the keys to the shackles. They steal weapons. Children are doing the same thing. Okay, so yes, the men are held in the hold of the ship. It's unsanitary. It's disease-ridden. It's dark. And they're held there for months, 3 to 4 months of the travel of the voyage. Okay. And so the triangular trade, we talked about it a little bit with New London, right? So there's a trade where you're bringing Africans from West Africa. So this part of Africa is West Africa. You're bringing Africans mostly to the Caribbean. Why? Why to the Caribbean? Why do most Africans go to Brazil and the Caribbean? You can't answer every question. Why?
Is it a shorter distance?
Huh?
Is it a shorter distance?
Sugar plantations.
You work here. Okay. What about sugar plantations?
They need the labor.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we got some plantations here in America. So why did most go there? What is it about the sugar cultivation? Right, and that might be stretching it.
Molasses?
No,
Molasses come from sugar?
yeah, it comes from sugar. No, but the production of, to cultivate sugar is very labor intensive. You need a lot of bodies working. You need people in the fields cutting the sugar cane. You need people at the pots boiling the sugar cane, right? You need, it has to be turned into molasses, like you said, right? And then processed into grain sugar you know, like grain sugar. Is that the word? Granulated. I was close. Granulated sugar. So Jamaica alone, 300,000 went to Jamaica, right? Of the entire slave trade, only 4% came to the American colonies, right? Only 4%. So by the Civil War, that number is 4 million. Okay, so that 4% becomes 4 million. Because the work wasn't as hard, there was more natural increase, people having babies if you don't have to work so hard, right? And so probably better health care and things like that. All right. And so the different ports in New England, Boston, Providence, Rhode Island had a few. Newport, Bristol, Warren, and Connecticut. New London was a port. So that's how they have the West Indian trade. So most who arrived in New England were the leftovers from the Caribbean trade. So 300 on the ship, 200 goes to Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and the other islands. I'm talking about the English islands, because each country had their own slave trade, right? So this way, you had Africans that are mostly dropped off in the West Indies, but New England slave ships always brought a few home to New England, okay? And I say a few. So we think about the Brown brothers in Rhode Island, who were big slave traders, Fanuel's uncles, her relatives were big slave traders. And so most are going to the West Indies, but some come home to New England. So where do these Africans come from? They come from basically West Africa. And when I say West Africa, I'm including Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Benin, right next to Old Calabar, which was Nigeria. So these are the names during the 17th and 18th century. And of course, we know once the British take over Africa in the late 1800s, the names will change. And West Central Africa. So we know that the first Africans, they say, that came to the English colonies was in Virginia, right, 1619. And we know that they were from West Central Africa. And the European country that colonized West Central Africa, right here, was the Portuguese. And so the Portuguese had been in West Africa really exploring, trying to kidnap Africans from the 1400s. And it's because of their expert building of ships that could withstand the waves and the wind, and to make long distance trips, the caravel ships that they built. And so they discovered what's called the Atlantic Islands on the west coast of Africa. This map doesn't have it, but when I say Atlantic Islands off the west coast of Africa, which islands? Could you name one island that's off the west coast of Africa?
Cape Verde.
I was waiting for New England to say Cape Verde, right? That's what I tell my students. I was like, you know a lot of people from one of these islands, you know? Right, but other Madeira, Canary Islands was the only one the Spanish had, right? And so, huh? I can't hear you. The Azores? Yeah, Portugal had it though. Only, the Spanish only had the Canary Islands. That was the only one. Okay, so West Africa, and mostly West Central Africa, we know that Phyllis Wheatley comes from Senegambia, right? Paul Cuffey, who I'll talk about, when I talk about Old Bridgewater, his father was from Ghana because Cuffy is a Ghanaian name. It's a male name. I don't know which day of the week you're born on to get the name, but it's a Ghanaian. So we know his father's from Ghana. Anybody been to the Isaac Royal House? Oh my goodness. Field trip. We need a field trip. Okay. So Isaac Royal, his family was originally from Maine. You know, when Maine was a frontier. And so he left Maine and went to Antigua to make his fortune in sugar. But the problem was, see, the enslaved people in the Caribbean, they had the numbers, and so they could rebel. They had or planned, didn't always carry off these conspiracies to start rebellions. So he's in Antigua, there are plans for rebellions. A couple of his enslaved people in Antigua was involved in the planning of the rebellion. And so that got to be a bit much for the Royals, and they decided to come back to Massachusetts. And they settled, this is Medford, but he had houses and land in other places in Massachusetts. So Royal comes, his father initially is the one that brings the family back to New England and build these houses. So the Royal House is one of the few places where you can find slave quarters still standing in New England. And so this is the house that the Royals lived in, and these are the slave quarters. So even for family or friends, it's a good kind of historical outing to take. And so, anyone know the controversy with Isaac Royal and Harvard? I know my professor knows it. Okay. So Isaac Royal Jr., he was a loyalist, and he left Massachusetts. But before he did, he donated a lot of money to Harvard. You know, Harvard's been around since early 1600s, I believe.
36.
What was that?
1636.
Okay, 1630. I was close. I said 1600s. And so he donated a lot of money, and his picture hangs up in Harvard. And so there's been organization and demands that his picture be taken down because he enslaved Africans. His brother was living here when he's in Antigua. They had a slave trade going on. In Antigua, they would send Africans to Boston to be sold, and I think his brother was Jeremiah, would sell them. So there's been demand. I'm not sure the picture's still there, but it might have come down. Okay. Maybe I could just hit that. Oh, that works. So the provisions and carrying trade, we talked about that in terms of New London. Basically, these merchant ships are going from New England, but not only New England, Pennsylvania, New York, and they're transporting goods such as lumber, grain. Connecticut provides the horses, livestock, fish, and rum. So it's an interesting story about fish because New Englanders did not like codfish. And it becomes a staple in the West Indies because this fish is shipped down to the West Indies and fed to the enslaved population. So even today, somebody from the Caribbean, if they're going to make a meal, particularly a breakfast meal, they're going to have this other food called ackee and codfish. So it still remains like the fish that they love here because whites didn't like it and they shipped it down to the West Indies. So the West Indies is so involved in sugar production that they don't even have time to grow food or to feed themselves or to feed the enslaved people that are working in these plantations. And so basically, New England and other colonies are feeding the West Indies. They're bringing grain, bread, and all vegetables, cows, whatever they needed, they was bringing it from the West Indies. In return, so provisions, they're providing provisions for the West Indies. They're carrying back from the West Indies. Somebody brought up the molasses, and then cotton, indigo, and sugar. Because in the process of molasses, you're going to, when you boil the sugar cane, the liquid that comes off is the molasses. And so why did New England really participate in the molasses trade? Why did New England, Massachusetts mostly, and Rhode Island participate in the molasses trade? I know you know that one. Huh? Rum. So how much rum did they have? So y'all know that story, yeah? Okay. So they had like 50 distilleries in Massachusetts, and probably the same amount in Rhode Island. And it was like the best rum. They say when they would bring it to West Africa, the chiefs or the kings, they loved New England rum. It became like a sort of a currency that you could trade for slaves and give them rum. That's how much they loved it. Okay, so yeah, the rum. Y'all know the rum story. Okay, and so let's look at life in New England. I got to get through this. I think I'm talking too much. And so life conditions of enslaved people. I've done some work with the Dorothy Quincy Homestead, helping high school students who are serving as docents at the property understand what the life for enslaved people was in this house, because many of the Edmund Quincy's from this lineage had enslaved people. So Africans were a presence in this house. Domestic servants lived in the home. So when you're a domestic servant living in a residence versus working in the field, you're on call 24/7. The baby wakes up, the wife is sick, we need a drink of water, so you're always on call. They slept in the garret space, which is like the attic, or they slept near the fireplace, while women slept on the floor near the children to be able to take care of them. Women worked nonstop, completing tasks like cleaning, cooking, sewing, spinning, washing clothes, fetching water, serving meals, and caring for children. Enslaved men had more mobility. They had more freedom of movement because some of them were dock workers, chauffeurs. When they dropped off the enslaver, they had time for themselves. They could meet with some of their friends. They ran errands. They took care of horses. And they worked on ships because of Boston Harbor. Men and women wore used clothes or items produced just for the enslaved. So burlap type of material was used to make slave clothes. And so probably the most traumatic experience for enslaved people is to have your family sold away, right? To an enslaver, slavery is about finances and making money. And so if he's in a financial situation, most enslavers are not going to hesitate. And so I had somebody say to me the other day, when I was talking about, the trauma of being sold away. But didn't that just happen in the South? They didn't sell people away in the North. I was like, really? I was like, really? So this advertisement says, to be sold. A normal, healthy Negro boy, about 15 years old, and these are his attributes. He's fit for either town or country, so that means he can work doing farming, or he could work in town, as a chauffeur or a driver. Has been used to farming business, And then for further information, you can contact this office. So yes, enslaved people were sold away in the North and in the South. So New England style slavery, only 1 to 2 persons of African descent was in each enslaving household, mostly in New England. Now you did have some of the rural areas like in Connecticut where you have dairy farms and you had more Narragansett, where they have more plantations like in Connecticut. But in Boston, right, or in Providence, locations like that, only 1 to 2 persons were in a household. So enslaved men and women could legally marry. And I'm going to go through some of the rights that they had. But spouses were not always allowed to live together. So you could legally get married, right? But if that enslaver had no need for you in his house, you had to stay with yours. And so that made enslaved couples very difficult to have an intimate relationship or to even be able to keep their children. Children in New England, I'm not going to say it was across the border, but there's some instances where children, because this is domestic slavery, people are doing domestic work in houses or working in Boston itself. There's no need for children. If it was a farm, children could do things like pick up the trash, you know, or pick up some of the whatever crop that you're collecting, they could pick it up. But in a New England home, there's no need. And so they would sell them away or give them away like puppies. Oh, I got a baby for you. You know, you can't have babies, then here's one for you. And so the family dynamics were a little more traumatic than even maybe in the South, where you lived in a hut and log cabin, I should say, and you were able to have your family until maybe they're thrown away. So I say marriage was legal in New England, right? I think it's the Puritan influence that, you know, no, you're not going to be cohabiting in sin, you're going to marry. But in the South, it was not legal. It was not legal. Why not?
Because of the whole idea of institution? Because of the whole idea of an institution?
What does that mean?
Well, you're owned by the slaveholder, okay? And it's an institution. That institution breaks the bond between you and the slaveholder.
Or selling you away breaks the bond of the husband and the wife, right? Because when you marry, right, and you are entering into a partnership and a bond that should not be broken by anybody. So you shouldn't get divorced, you need to stay with them for the rest of your life, right? So, but an enslaver being able to sell you away. Because legally, when you get married, it's saying that you have this bond that's going to last for the, you know, till death do you part, right? And they couldn't sell away someone who was legally married and had that bond with their spouses, right? And so we know that's where they're jumping in the broom, because enslaved people did find partners. They did have babies. And so they substituted. You know, sometimes enslavers would let them have a little reception, but it was about breaking that bond of married couples. Okay, so segregation in the Puritan meeting house. They had to sit somewhere away from the whites who were in the meeting house. Native people had to do that, and also African Americans. Okay, so civil liberties. Because of the Puritan influence, these are rights that many in the South did not have. I think, you know, everyone in the South did not have. So you could learn to read and write. but you could not go to school. Okay? So if the mistress of the house wanted to take the time, it's a wonderful story of Frederick Douglass and his narrative where the mistress is teaching him to read. She wants to teach him to read, and her husband says, "Why are you doing that? You're going to make him obstinate, right? You're going to make him ornery. So stop it." So Frederick Douglass had to stop, the mistress had to stop teaching him. But Frederick Douglass was determined to learn how to read and write, so he was in Baltimore for a period. The plantation he grew up on was in Maryland, but they had family in Baltimore, and they had sent him there. He would go out to the street and find little indentured boys, and they would mark on the street letters and numbers. And because this was a nice mistress, they fed him well. He was, much better than the plantation, and he would take food to the little indentured boys. And that's how he learned to read and write, and eventually writes his own narrative. So you could learn to read and write, but you could not legally go to school. There's an interesting anecdote of Abigail Adams. She had kind of taken a little African-American boy under her wing, but this is post-American Revolution, and she wanted to send him to school, and they didn't allow her to. And she, Abigail Adams would write about everything. And so she was, that is ridiculous, I cannot send him to school. But you could sue and be sued in court. You could have legal counsel if your enslaver paid for it. You could own personal property, but you could not buy land unless you were free. You could sign a contract. Black males could join the militia. Sometimes that right was taken away. And mostly enslaved men were able to purchase their freedom. Some, not everybody, but if the enslavers said yes for this price, they could work in the weekends. They could work extra during the evening and get that money. It was more difficult for women. They're in the house 24/7. They can't leave and get a second job. Okay, numbers. This is 1750. There had been a slave census done around that time, which I think most of the colonies didn't report the right information, but Massachusetts, 5,000, Rhode Island's right behind, 4,000. Connecticut takes the lead, 6,000, more plantations, more big type of farming there. New Hampshire, 671. Once Maine becomes, a frontier area, 322. And little Vermont, 22, because Vermont will pass a constitution that forbids slavery. And that's soon after, that's like, I think before, they're the first one to end slavery in New England with their constitution. Okay. And these are also some numbers, if you compare to the South, Maryland, 63,000, North Carolina, 69,000, South Carolina, 75,000, Georgia, 15,000. Takes Georgia a little while, but they catch up. Okay, and so don't think that enslaved people weren't punished in New England because they could learn to read and write and can go to court. But let me just say this about being separated from your spouse. You could get permission to visit your spouse, depending on the spouse's enslaver and your enslaver agreeing to your visit. So they weren't totally kept apart. Strict laws restricted voluntary movements. So there's a curfew, 9 o'clock from the early 1700s. They received whippings, most often for any infraction. They could not complain in court about being mistreated, not like indentured servants could. And they could be banished to the West Indies to work on sugar plantations that shortened their lives. That was the most egregious, punishment you could have. So I'm going to end here and come to Bridgewater. Okay, you want to stand up, take a break or anything? You want to keep going? All right, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, let me pull that one up. How do I? I get out of here? Oh, escape. Okay. And so I'm going to put this one down, and I'm going to bring up this one. Oh, my Norton. I changed to Norton, and they are really a pain. Okay, so with this one, I am going to, this is not going to be a PowerPoint presentation. Very few PowerPoints do I have. I'm going to be doing more talking for this presentation, but I have a few little things that I will focus on, and I will show a presentation. I mean, a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so we're going to talk about individuals in Bridgewater who were enslavers. And then we're going to talk about a free African-American family that settled in North Bridgewater. And so we're going to talk about slavery for as much information as that I have, okay? And we start with Reverend James Keith, and I'm sure you from Bridgewater know Reverend James Keith, who was the first minister that came to Bridgewater, where he organized the first parish church in 1664. Born in Scotland, migrated, Iris Mather hooked him up, and he got this parish position, the church position. He settled in West Bridgewater, married, had 9 children, and one of the people he enslaved was a man named Toby Tarbet. And I'm going to talk about Toby. It's a really interesting story about Toby. So one of the interesting stories about slavery in Bridgewater that I located is about an African man named Toby Tarbet, who was enslaved by the Reverend James Keith until the minister's death in 1719. Okay, we don't have to go through Keith's background, but with the support of Increase Mather, which I said, he became the first minister of the Puritan church here. Reverend Keith's story as a Puritan minister is known to many. The history of the African man he enslaved is not. It is these little known stories of enslaved people in New England that I want to uncover and write about. Toby was, after Reverend Keith's death in 1719, Tony was bequeathed to his heirs, to Reverend Keith's heirs. So he's described as a person who made unrelenting efforts to free his family. So he was twice married. Toby married Bilham in 1728 before he fathered 11 children with his second wife, Dinah Gold. He grew perturbed when his wife's enslaver, Seth Howard, and this is Howard Street, right? Okay, sold Dinah to a man in Abington, Massachusetts. So Dinah and her 11 children are being sold to someone else in Abington, Massachusetts. So Toby took the matter into his own hands. He had enough of bondage and the bondage of his family. So Toby went to Abington. He gathered up his wife and children. He took them to live in a small hut that he built in the Matfield Swamp. Anybody ever heard of that swamp? Matfield.
It must be the Hawthorne.
Whatever that is. So I have to do some research to know. So he's in this swamp, which he hid them for several years. You want to sell my family away? You can't get my family. And so his neighbors around the swamp helped him to shield his family. So the efforts by the Keiths and the Howard family to retrieve this enslaved family proved futile. So this makeshift house was built on a soft and deep bog. So I did look up bog, because I'm from Brooklyn, New York. We don't have no bogs there, okay? And so a bog is kind of like a swamp because it's water, but it has vegetation that kind of grows in the bog. They said wood is kind of present in a swamp. I don't know. And so when Sheriff Whitmarsh of Abington attempted to arrest Toby, not only was he able to catch the fleeing fugitive, but the sheriff, not only was he unable to catch the fleeing fugitive, but the sheriff soon found himself falling off the wooden pathway that Toby had constructed over the muddy bog. So in able to get to the house, you had to step on these pieces of wood to get to his house. The sheriff is trying to get to him, and he's falling into the muddy bog that's, the wood is over. So having to depend on a hysterical Toby, because Toby's laughing at him, because he's like falling and he's trying to help himself, he depended on Toby to pull him out of that quagmire. So it was both embarrassing and humbling for the sheriff. The now exhausted sheriff gave up his chase of Toby once he was extricated from all that filth. So another sheriff comes, and he's gonna see if he can get Toby. So Toby sought refuge at an elderly man's house named George Williams when this Sheriff White came after him. And Mr. Williams adamantly refused to allow the sheriff to enter his house to retrieve Toby. You're not coming in here to get Toby. So these incidents occurred close to the time when slavery in the state of Massachusetts was beginning to weaken. And so soon thereafter, Toby was able to attain his freedom in a legal jury proceeding. Toby's daughter, Dinah, was not as fortunate since another jury ruled that she was to remain a servant for life to Elijah Snell and Jesse Howard, the two men who enslaved Toby and his family. So further research will uncover, I would like to know what happened to Toby's wife during this and to the other 10 children to see legally if they were brought before the court and what happened. So it was the wife's bondage that was the impetus for Toby hiding the family in the swamp. And so hearing the story of Toby and his family was enlightening to me since I had only read of black runaways in the South finding refuge in a swamp. So we think of Maroons, and I don't know if you think of Maroons, but Maroons were runaway enslaved people, particularly in Jamaica. They would hide in the mountains away from the British. The British would send the British Army there to chase down these Maroons. They fight a war for a number of years trying to catch these Maroons in Jamaica, and they eventually lose. I think it was a 40-year war or something like that. And these Maroons were able to hide out. They were able to militarily defeat the British Army, and they wind up signing a treaty where they got land from the British Army, and those Maroons still live on those, Maroon descendants still live on that land. So you heard about this, well, at least I, as a historian, heard about it in the Caribbean, but I did not know, and I heard about it in the South. There's a really good book about runaways, maroonage, as we call it, in the United States, but mostly in the South. And so to hear that this took place in New England was exciting to me. And so while there were runaway ads for enslavers in Scituate, Halifax, and Hingham and Weymouth, it is not surprising that there were also runaways from Bridgewater. Abia Keith, the grandson of Reverend James Keith, must have had a difficult time locating 32-year-old Violetus, who reported to have run off with Henry Traveler, a free Negro. Mr. Keith ran his ads looking for Violetus at least 3 times in 1773. So he would put them in the newspaper. If you see this Negro, you can bring them to this location and you'll get £1 for bringing them in, not 5 pounds. A woman named Nancy, who was enslaved by Samuel Willis of Bridgewater, also had difficulty finding Nancy after she ran away in 1773, since Mr. Willis ran his ads for 4 times in that time. And so some of the research that I've uncovered, I'll share. And so I came to the Historical Society and did research on death records. And it's interesting because they had the death records, but they, in the back, would give you the death records of Negroes. They weren't put with the whites as far as the death records, so they were separately and apart in the back of the death record book. And so I found, and I'm only naming enslavers, there's names out there of enslaved people, but I was trying to connect them to who might have owned them. So Mr. Edson name is very important because I believe, where's Mary? Mary's gone? Okay, so I believe Reverend Keith's wife was Sarah Edson? Susanna. All right, now, get me straight. Good. Edson, though. Yes. Okay, so this Edson name is throughout the records, right? And I need to find out why. So Mr. Edson's Negro, Esquire Edson's Negro, Captain Edson's Negro child. These are people that died. Josiah Leonard's Negro, Mr. Shaw's Negro woman, Mr. Edson's Negro women. So they give you the dates of the death. Mr. Edson's Negro child, Nero, servant of Dan Perkins. And in the 18th century, I found this was interesting. So when slavery ends, there are African Americans who remain in the houses of their enslaver, working as servants, or just don't have any other place to go. And so this is in 1786, slavery ends in 1783, and the widow Edson's Negro boy, 1791. So they're living in the households. So other evidence of slavery sales in legal records, James Hearsay's bill of sale to Edward Mitchell for pilot, I put the pilot, oh boy, in 1738. Negro Coffee sold by John Orchard to Arthur Hams in 1741. George Keith sold Seppo to Joseph Keith in 1774. And so other entries that I found, Candace Indito is living with Esquire Orr, Schindler is living with Dr. Ortiz, Philly is living with Mr. Angiers, King Ring, like that name, and his children, Patience, Jenny, Mary, and Fanny, are living with Colonel Simcon Carey, and Susanna and Oxford live with Daniel Howard. And so I'm going to move on. That's the beginning of my research, trying to look at slavery. What time is it? Ooh, okay, we're winding up. Yes.
A lot of those people you mentioned in that were owned by those who own ships.
How you know that?
Well, because you said chief of so-and-so.
I said what?
If you go back one, I thought I heard chief. Let me see.
Go back to the other one.
Colonel okay.
Now, I don't doubt that some of them were involved, in some kind of trade, maybe to the West Indies, or even a local trade, having ship. I don't doubt that. Captain Edson's Negro child?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but captain could be military too. It could be military. Okay, but no,
I'm thinking because they move these ships back and forth, they have the ability to do something.
yes. So I don't know how much involvement Bridgewater had in the slave trade, but you take a place like Bristol, Rhode Island, and the death records are full of ship captains who die at sea, but also who have enslaved Africans. So you see more of that like in a port that is involved in the slave trade, like Bristol, Rhode Island. Okay? All righty. So free people of color. I found this interesting. I was looking up something else and this popped up. And I was like, I need to share this. So this free man of color of Bridgewater, Sash, he married first in Bridgewater, December 1st, 1706. He married Mary Cornish, who died between February 1718, 1719, when her youngest child was born. And in 1724, Sash married for a second time. He married the second time at the First Church of Bridgewater, November 11, 1724. And this time he married Margaret Linsford. And so Sash was identified as a Negro both in the marriage records, but there was a question about whether his wives, you know, he's a free man of color, were white. And so there's a historian, Gloria Whiting, who has done some really good research on family life in Boston, as far as enslaved couples, how they were forced to live apart, and what impact. And she has definitively said that Margaret Linsford was a woman of color. So there's this like back and forth with the historians. Is she white? And this particular notice says that they think she was white, but Gloria Whiting, who I respect her word, said that she was a person of color. So she had children of Sash and Mary. So they list the children, and I found it interesting. So with Mary, he had 4, and with Margaret, this should say Mary, he had 3 children. So just a little view into a free man of color. So I'm going to do the last part of my presentation, and then I'm going to let the class go. Okay. You can see I enjoy doing this. Okay. We're going to talk about the Easton family. And I did bring not many handouts, so you have to pass them around, like, maybe you can pass it behind you. This is the family tree of the Easton family. Okay. Can you just give the rest? Just like as many can, and just pass it around. Okay. So we're going to talk about the Easton family, a free family in Bridgewater, but with an amazing history. And so I'm going to start out talking, and then I have just a few slides on that one, because there's no pictures of them. One is a Revolutionary veteran, and there's no pictures. I can't understand that. So let me get started. We're going to talk about Easton family. E-A-S-T-O-N. Okay. Okay. So while there are stories to uncover about many other enslaved persons who are on the list that I compiled, who were denied their freedom in Bridgewater, there's a better known story of Caesar Easton, who was believed to have been enslaved from birth by Peter Easton, the son of Nicholas Easton. But he was not enslaved in Bridgewater, Caesar. We're going back to like late 1600s, early 1700s. And so Nicholas Easton co-founded Newport, Rhode Island, and served as Newport's president from 1650 to 1654, and he was their governor from 1672 to 1674. I could have showed a picture of him. But it's believed that the Eastons freed their enslaved blacks and indentured Native Americans after Nicholas and Peter became Quakers in the 1650s. So we know the position that Quakers will take on slavery. It'll take a while before it's totally in effect in the 1700s. So the archival research documents that the wills of Peter Easton and his son specified that their native indentured servants and their enslaved African persons were to be given their freedom upon their demise. Given that Peter and his son owned both native and Africans in Rhode Island in the 17th century, a scholar or one who just finished his dissertation on the Easton family. He did a lot of research on the Easton family. He contends, George R. Price contends, that the Caesars' parents and ancestors were both of African and Wampanoag genealogy. So this conclusion, he reaches this conclusion based on the fact that the Newport Island was the westernmost ancestral territory of the Wampanoags. This explains why Caesar and his family, when they left Newport, they joined their Wampanoag clan in Tetticott, which was both a Massachusetts and a Wampanoag community in Millborough, Mass. Upon arriving to Tetticott, Caesar married an African and Wampanoag woman named Mercy Gonjuary in 1740. Caesar and Mercy's 5 children were not only born free, but they were born heirs to 90 acres of land in Tetticott that Mary inherited from her Wampanoag family. However, Caesar and Mercy Easton will find it increasingly difficult to hold on to their land once a white lawyer by the name of Elkanah Leonard of Middleborough sets his sights on acquiring as much native land as he could in Tetticott. Such schemes of having native people sign away their land after being plied with extensive amounts of alcohol, getting native men to serve as accomplices with him in a scheme to take away native land, and even using native men who were not related to the Wampanoag clan to marry a Massachusetts woman or a Wampanoag woman in order to get the land the woman personally owned in order to sell it to the English. So people like Leonard, I'll call him, because that Elkanah, not only had extensive land holdings in Middleborough, but he also owned land that bordered Tetticott. In 1753, Leonard claimed ownership of 17 acres of Caesar and Mary's land based on a sale with a native man, probably who was not Wampanoag, and this lawsuit was brought. He's saying that Leonard is saying he owns 17 acres of the land that Caesar and Mercy owned. And this lawsuit was the start of the Easton family's long history of resisting injustice, since Caesar used a land claim deed that he had from the 1748s to fight and win his case against Leonard. But Leonard wouldn't rest. Leonard, they say he became like a little mentally ill. So he had his wife and son bring a subsequent lawsuit on behalf of him. This second claim was based on a deed they say that Caesar's mark was on, which in effect quit-claimed, right? Sold these 17 acres to Leonard for 10 shilling. So he couldn't get it by saying that this native man was able to get this land from him initially. So he says now that Caesar himself sold this land, signed his mark. And so the Leonards took Caesar to Plymouth Court, where a jury entered a ruling that required Caesar to turn over 16 acres of his land to Mr. Leonard. Although the Easton family and other native families in Tetticott struggled to hold on to their land, by the 1760s, both the Massachusetts and the Wampanoags were being incrementally disposed of their land. And by 1780s, Caesar and Mercy had lost all 90 acres of the land to encroaching whites like Leonard. And by the 1790s, there were no native people living in Tetticut. So the adult children, Season and Mercy, will move to Bridgewater, Taunton, and Dartmouth, where the generations of Eastons came to live out their lives. So by early 19th century, Caesar's son, James, was settled in the town of North Bridgewater. James Easton was not only a Revolutionary War veteran, but with the help of his sons, he had 4 sons, he owned and operated an independent iron implement manufacturing business, successfully using his skills as a manufacturing blacksmith and an iron tool maker. So I couldn't find pictures of the Easterns, of course, not of their business, so I thought I'd share some ironworks tools with you. Some of the things he might have made in his shop. He and his sons, Caleb, Joshua, Sylvanus, and Hosea, would also establish a school that taught blacksmithing and tool making to young persons. James Easton and his sons also farmed 120 acres in that same location. The Easton family not only had to battle racism as entrepreneurs in a highly competitive ironworks business, but James and his sons had to be professionally trained to acquire the skills needed for manufacturing these iron implements, but there also were times when they needed financial support. One of James Easton's most generous benefactors was his customer and friend, Paul Cuffey, the successful merchant and whaling ship owner who was also of African and Native heritage, but was known to be one of the wealthiest men of the time. Regrettably, the Easton family struggled to stay in business after facing a number of lawsuits that were the result of mounting debts from 1817 to 1830, when the family-run factory and school came to a crashing halt after the deaths of James Easton and his son Sylvanus in 1830. So subsequent generations of the Easton family continued to face discrimination in their communities, particularly in their churches around the issue of segregated seating. Whites wouldn't allow black parishioners to buy. You had to kind of buy the seat, I think, in those days. They were not allowed to buy the seat, and so they couldn't sit where whites sat, and they fought it. Sometimes they would leave that church and go to another church because of that. And also being forced to attend segregated and inferior schools. So there's a story of a young girl, Sarah Roberts, and there's a book out, you might want to read it, called The Long Walk, Sarah's Long Walk. And so Benjamin Roberts was Sarah's father. He was the son of Jane Easton's daughter, Sarah, and his father was Robert Roberts. Robert Roberts was from South Carolina. Benjamin is known for his passionate but unsuccessful legal fight to desegregate Boston Common Schools in 1849. Robert brought litigation against the city of Boston because his daughter Sarah was forced to walk a long distance past several white schools in Boston to reach the black school, which was considered inferior to the white schools that she walked past. After the court found in the favor of the city of Boston, thereby refusing to admit Sarah and her little brother, Benjamin Jr., rather than have his children walk long blocks to the black school, Benjamin Roberts moved to Cambridge, where the common schools were integrated. So in conclusion, as the Eastons built their businesses and worked in their established professions, their descendants of their enslaved ancestor, Caesar, never gave up fighting for the equal rights they were denied. For 5 successive For 5 successive generations over 200 years, the Easterns, as Native Americans, fought their way out of slavery and tried hard to fight against fraudulent theft of their ancestral land. As African Americans, they fought against racism in the business environment and an unending discrimination and segregation in the New England community. Thank you. So how long do we have for questions? 15 minutes? We can do it. Questions, come on now.
Are any of the descendants of the Eastern family still around?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'd probably have to do some genealogy research, thank you, to find out. Yeah, definitely. You know, this is a project I think I started last year, and when I was here, Mary said to me, well, you can come back and present for us. I was like, okay. Any other questions? We did a lot of talking tonight. Yes.
Just a comment. I'd love to find out where the enslavers of the 1700s lived. Where were their homes? Where the slave people
Here in Bridgewater.
worked. Yeah.
Okay.
Some
Where
of
the?
those homes may still exist.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind as I do research.
Tory House in Bridgewater.
Huh?
The Tory House in Bridgewater.
Is one of them?
Yeah.
So what's the name of the slaver?
What was the, I believe the letter that you mentioned owned the Tory House at one point, and I believe.
What's the name? Letterman? What's the? What was the name?
The name of the house?
The people that lived there.
One of them was the Leonard and Edson. There was an Edson that owned that house.
Oh, was it Edson?
Yeah, and famous slaves, William and Ellen Craft, went through that house on their way to freedom.
What?
You know their story?
Oh, I know their story.
They stopped at the Tory
They
house
still on their way to Canada.
on their way to Canada.
Everybody know the story of Ellen and William Craft? You want to tell it?
Oh, boy. I'll try to be really quick. And I always get emotional, I'm sorry. She was very white-skinned Negro. Her husband was very dark-skinned. They met when she was like 18. They married, did not want to have children because they didn't want their children to be sold. She looked white. She was, her mother was biracial, and her father was the plantation owner, so she looked white.
What
So
state did they come from?
They devised a plan to escape. She dressed up as a man.
Where were they coming from?
They were coming from Macon, Georgia, I believe. Yeah. And she was a seamstress, he was a carpenter, so they saved their money, bought her one really nice men's clothes. She dressed as a man. He was her slave because a white woman would never travel with a
Black man.
Yeah. So she had to be a man. She covered her face with poultices and wore a scarf around her neck to hide her Adam's apple in her beard. Her Latin beard, sorry. And they made their way north and landed in Boston. And then the Slave Act of 1850 came along where they were hunted. So they didn't feel safe. They moved to Canada, then they went to England, came back to Macon County, and tried to educate the freed slaves.
Came back to Georgia?
To Georgia. The
Oh,
Macon,
she know
tried
more
to-
than I do.
tried to, educate the slaves, and the KKK kept burning their school down. So they
Oh, you-
finally just gave up and taught underneath a tree somewhere. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's very good. Let's get it. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, you.
What types of records did you use for, sorry, like where did you find them? I know you mentioned like some.
The death records?
Yeah.
Right. The dissertation that, the young man wrote on the Eastern family. But You just, you basically, you could look at church records, you know, particularly since the Eastons were involved with these church disputes and everything. Help me.
Here. There's probably records here.
Yeah. I spent some time here. You know, so people have compiled information, not only death records, but wills. Yeah, wills and wills is a good source because if you can find a will that will name the people that were enslaved, so that will identify people that were enslaved. But wills are very good. But I think, and probably even doing genealogy research, you know, particularly on some of the better known whites who might have enslaved African Americans, and looking at their genealogy and trying to understand it. So there are a lot of places you could start your research and continue. Books that are written on a particular subject. Like when I was here, I looked at books on the history of Bridgewater and got, you know, some understanding of like that. Okay, was there another question? Yes.
And you mentioned that slavery became illegal in 1783 in Massachusetts or broader than that?
It's Massachusetts. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the legal basis for slavery is vacated at that point, but it doesn't mean that everybody actually is suddenly free.
That's right.
It's like the case, you know, the judge says there's no more legal basis
Right.
for slavery, but that doesn't mean that everybody actually
No, definitely. And there was no kind of police monitoring, like, did you free your slave, right? Or in the South when the Emancipation Proclamation, and you have the U.S. Army coming to Texas, okay, you got to free them because it's time, you know, that kind of thing. So the two lawsuits that were brought, so, you know, after the revolution, a new constitution is written. One important player was Mom Bet, Elizabeth Freedman, who's working for Selfridge, I think his name. He's a lawyer. She's this maid, and they're talking about the new constitution, trying to decide what's going to go in it. And she asked her, the slaver, well, does this constitution free me? You know, and so he brings a case for her. So she's the first case, and she will get her freedom. But what seals it is a second case. So I think hers was 1781, Quock Walker, right? Quock Walker had been promised his freedom. His enslaver dies. The wife said, well, I'm definitely going to free you at 25. And she gets married, and her husband said, no, he's not going to be free. He's going to stay in slavery. And so he basically kind of runs away to his original enslaver who had promised him, because the husband of the wife was pretty much abusing him. So he kind of runaways to the sons of the original enslaver, and they kind of hide him. And then the husband sends people out, beat him up, bring him back, and so the sons of the original enslaver is going to help him bring a lawsuit. And when that lawsuit is heard in 1783, that will end slavery legally in the courts. But other colonies will do it in different ways, as far as something called gradual abolition, gradual emancipation. You're going to free all the children when they get to be 25 or 28, and the adults will be freed at another time. So Rhode Island does that, New York does that, Connecticut, I believe, also. New Hampshire, basically, it kind of dies out there, but they, I think, eventually have kind of legislated act that's going to be passed, but they don't have many enslaved people by then. And as I told you, Vermont signed the Constitution banning slavery in Vermont.
What would a slave get to prove that they were free if they wanted to move around? Let's say they wanted to leave Massachusetts and go to New York.
You mean after they were freed?
Yeah.
What would they get?
Well, we get a passport to leave the United States.
Today we get passports. We didn't get passports. I don't think they had passports in the 1700s.
They got a piece of paper or something that proved they were free?
Yeah, manumissions, like if you were, so the law says now you're free 1783. So there's no way anybody could be held as a slave in Massachusetts because of that law. But before that, enslavers were free. You know, on my death, I want, like I said, the Easterns, when they died, they said, we're going to free our native indentured servants, and we're going to free the African slaves as well. Mm-hmm. So manumission is to free them, but you have to sign a legal document for that. And so I don't know if they got a copy, but they knew they were free. So, you know, manumission papers, but that's before the law in slavery. Okay, we good? Your teacher?